Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining. Welcome to the latest installment of our EcoFlora virtual seminar series. My name is Lydia Paradiso, and I'm a doctoral student at the New York Botanical Garden and a graduate fellow with the New York City EcoFlora project. EcoFlora is a community science project with three main goals: to investigate urban ecosystems and urbanization, to support open source biodiversity data, and to increase the understanding and appreciation of plant life. To date, over 34,000 observers have made about 970,000 observations of about 12,000 species of plants and other organisms in New York City and posted them onto iNaturalist. You can explore all of these observations on our project page on iNat, which I am going to throw into the chat. Should have learned by now to have it ready to go to put it in there. Each month, we also sponsor an EcoQuest challenge, which encourages New Yorkers to observe a particular species, group of plants, or interaction and post them onto iNaturalist. Our June EcoQuest, which is about to come to a close, is all about Apiaceae, which is focused on plants from Apiaceae or the carrot family. And our upcoming July EcoQuest, which we don't have an official name yet, we're taking suggestions, will ask observers to document occurrences of beech leaf disease. Beech leaf disease, which is caused by a nematode, affects both native and introduced species of beech. Primarily affects the foliage and causes distinctive striping, curling, and thinning of the leaves. Little is known about this disease and how it spreads, so identifying new areas of infestation is very important. Currently, there are only 37 observations of beech leaf disease on iNaturalist in New York City and less than 20 observations on IMAP Invasives, which is New York State's invasive plant tracking app. And however, I know I've been seeing it all over the city. So there's definitely more than 37 occurrences of it. So keep an eye out for an email from us at the beginning of July with more information and a link to that project. However, you don't have to wait until then to post observations of this on iNaturalist. If you are not on our mailing list and you would like to get more information about EcoQuests, other virtual and in-person events, you can do so right here. And now I will turn it over to Tomi.
All right, hey everybody. So before I introduce our speaker tonight, I will start with a land acknowledgement per usual by recognizing the original people of this land, the Lenape, as well as their deep connection to the Lenape-Hoking homeland. As a representative of an organization dedicated to advocating for the more than human world, it is imperative to acknowledge the original stewards of this land, the Lenape, as well as the settler colonial genocide perpetrated against them and other indigenous communities. It's also very important to recognize the resilience of the Lenape and all indigenous communities who still today continue to resist erasure. In the chat, I'm going to post a link to donate to the Lenape Center. All right, so for our speaker tonight, his name is Dr. Eric Sanderson. He is the Vice President of Urban Conservation here at the New York Botanical Garden. Sanderson earned a Ph.D. in Ecology and a B.A.S. in English and Biochemistry from the University of California, Davis. He is the author of the best-selling book Mannahatta, A Natural History of New York City, and 3 other books about biodiversity loss and climate change. He is an optimist, despite his work as a historian, conservation biologist, and urbanist. In his talk tonight, Dr. Sanderson will discuss how we can and must take nature seriously in our decision-making, and how our knowledge of the historical ecology of a city can be leveraged to plan for the future. Please feel free to enter any questions or comments into the chat as we go. At the conclusion of the talk, we will begin a question and discussion session where those of you who have questions will be able to ask them. If you have a question or comment that you would like to ask verbally at the end of the talk, you can use the raise hand feature or note in the chat that you would like to ask, and you will have the opportunity to do so. All right, I will now hand it over to Eric to begin our seminar.
Great, thanks Tomi, and thanks Lydia, and thank you all for joining tonight. I'm going to give a talk that I gave to the Department of City Planning a couple of weeks ago about the importance of nature in New York City. And this talk for city planning and this talk tonight are really my sort of first attempts to articulate what an urban conservation strategy for the New York Botanical Garden might look like. So I really look forward to that conversation, the respectful conversation afterwards, and look forward to your thoughts and questions. I'll speak for 30, 35 minutes, something like that. And then we'll have a lot of chance to talk. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. So nature, your city, biodiversity, and the future of New York. Oops. All right. So this is all about nature in your city. And how nature will save New York City. I gave the talk to city planning a few days after the big smoke event earlier this month, which I'm sure many of you who are here in New York City recall. This was yet a new manifestation, all the ways that climate change can mess with us. What's important to me is that nature will save the city if we take nature seriously in our city making. And I have really three points here. That we need to use the historical ecology as a guide. It provides a kind of spotlight and x-ray into what nature wants to do with the landscape where New York City is today. That we need to enlist vision makers from across the city in the process of imagining the city of the future and making it happen. And third, that we need to take climate change not only as a threat, but as an opportunity to change. I think it's really our generation's opportunity to change the shape of New York City. And I'll tell you why. And I'm going to start with a parable of 120 Broadway, which is the big building in Lower Manhattan where city planning is currently. It's this building here. It's actually an extraordinary building. This iteration of the Equitable Assurance Building was built in between 1912 and 1916. And when it opened, it was so tall, it's 35 stories tall. And as you can see, the building goes straight up from the side of the sidewalk. And in fact, this building is one of the reasons why we have a zoning code in New York City, because everybody looked at it and they're like, oh my God, if we build all our buildings right to the edges of the lot, there won't ever be any sunlight or any air down at the street level anymore in New York City. And so we need to take care of that. And so they passed the zoning code, which for the first time, certain restrictions on what people could do in terms of building on their own private property. But of course, that building wasn't the first building on the site. There was another building before that burnt down in 1912 in January of that year. You can see some of the firefighters fighting it. And that building was actually also a very important building. It was one of the largest buildings in New York City at the time it was built in 1868. This is the version of it in 1890, looking at sort of across the street from the Trinity Churchyard in Lower Manhattan. It had 7 stories, and then they added a couple more. It had these kind of mansard roofs that were fashionable in Paris at the time. It had the first passenger elevator in an office building in New York City. It had pumps to pump water up to the bathrooms. So it actually had running water in the upper stories. It was innovative in many, many kinds of ways. It had electric lights very early on. So, but it was the building that was there. But if you go back to 1867, the year before, or 1868, this is the map of the same block. So it's the block between Pine and Cedar and Broadway and Nassau Street. And you can see that there was an American Express there, and there was a couple banks and a real estate, but actually most of the block was empty. That it was still just kind of an open, probably ruined pasture land where people would keep their horses or their cows. And it had been that for actually a very, very long time. This is the famous Costello plan of New York City from 1660, and this yellow box over here is indicating where 120 Broadway is. And it was an empty lot. This wall here this is the wooden wall of Wall Street, probably constructed out of timber cut from this site and the blocks around it. And of course, what was there before then? If we were to go back to, say, a few hours before Henry Hudson arrived in 1609, we would have seen this beautiful Appalachian oak hickory forest, not too dissimilar to what you see in the New York Botanical Garden today, except that the forest back then would have had been larger trees and would have been half of the basal area would have been American chestnut trees. But of course, that forest hadn't been there forever either. That was the forest that was dominating the climate of 400 years ago. But if we go back another 2,000 years, when the climate was both cooler and drier, that same block would have been a pine forest like this. And if we go back another 4,000 years before that, it would have been a spruce larch woodland like this, a sort of recovering boreal forest after the glaciations. And if we go back another 10,000 years or so, it would have been tundra with icebergs floating around back at a time when a glacial lake was backed up and the lake level was 6 meters above the modern sea level. So this block of 120 Broadway would have been right on the beach. And of course, these last couple points were not about what people were doing. They were all about what the climate was doing. The climate changed, and then in response, the vegetation changed and the wildlife changed and the way people used the landscape changed. So this is just a brief little parable, but what does this story tell us? Well, I would deduce from this 4 lessons. One is that nature built this city. I mean, we like to think we built the city, that we built everything, but in fact, what nature gave us this template. Our buildings, especially our skyscrapers might seem monumental, but in fact, they're just decorations on a template that was designed by and for biodiversity through the mechanism of the climate. And that nature is larger and more powerful than we are, capable of utter devastation and breathtaking renewal. There were glaciers at one point upon a time, 400 feet high, taller than those buildings on top of this site, and then they melted away. You can't really stop nature when we're speaking in geologic terms. But by recognizing that, that's actually our chance. Nature offers us a chance to make a better city. So what does that mean specifically? Well, let's come a little bit closer back to our time, and I'll take you back to say 2009 when the city's first sustainability plan NYC was published. This was back in Mayor Bloomberg's administration, if you can remember back that far, back to 2009, and plan was for a greener and greater New York. The fascinating thing, if you read this report in detail, is that it's mostly about population. The big concern for the Bloomberg administration at the time was that the population of New York City was going to grow, and they wanted that because they wanted more tax revenue and they wanted more people to be here and they wanted people to love New York City. The city population at the time was around 8 million people, and they were predicting that by 2030, it would be 9 million people. And they knew that New York City couldn't physically grow anymore. It had reached its geographic limits, and there was very little space left to build new buildings or to do anything new. So their idea was that we needed to be more efficient with the space. And to be more efficient with the space and with the city, we needed to lean into insights that were emerging at the time from the environmental sustainability movement. It turns out, I'll just point out that they were right on the population side, but a little bit wrong on the timing. The Department of City Planning a couple of years ago published their report on the 2020 census, and they showed that in April of 2020, that New York City's population was already 8.8 million in total, and had been growing in all 5 boroughs over the previous decade. And of course, this is the city that we live in. This is the city that faces huge affordable housing crises and has huge issues about environmental justice, in large part because people, there's just not enough room for all the people that want to live here and be able to live here in an affordable way. So to just go back and talk a little bit more about this kind of Bloombergian idea of sustainability, because it was really in the air at the time. I don't know how many of you remember this book, Green Metropolis by David Owen. David Owen's a writer for the New Yorker. He'd written an essay in 2004 that was in the magazine called Green Manhattan. And basically his premise, which I still think is a great one, his premise is if you're an environmentalist, the very best thing you can do is to move to New York City. And why is that? Well, it's because if you move to New York City, you're probably not going to bring your car. And so you're going to shed all those kind of environmental externalities of your car. If you move to New York City, you're going to live probably in a smaller space than you would if you were living in some rural place. And you're going to share walls, then share heat back and forth. And the compensation for you, of course, is that though your space might be small, the outside is so interesting and so fascinating that you want to spend more time in the city and be a member and a citizen in its creation. You're more likely to take the subway. You're more likely to use less water and less resources. And in fact, if you look in the statistics that was reported in the NYC report, that compared the average water consumption of an average American at the time to an average New Yorker. And an average New Yorker, in part because of our lifestyle and in part because of environmental efficiencies that the city had put in over time, used 74% less water on a per person basis than an average American, and used 35% less electricity, and actually produced 45% less garbage on a per person basis. And the per person part is important because we know that a place like New York City uses just a ton of water every day and a ton of electricity, and generates, I mean, we all have seen the garbage line on the streets. We know that there's a lot of garbage, but if you actually divide it on a per person basis, it's less. This is sort of the green metropolis hypothesis, or this sort of idea that cities are actually a win-win for the environment. It's the place where you're using less on average per capita resources at the same time that you can have a job and you can have an urban life and you can have a kind of a career that fits, the person that you want to be. All of that changed in October of 2012 when Hurricane Sandy blew into town. Hurricane Sandy was just a ginormous storm. It was, over 1,000 miles wide, and it caused more than $60 billion in damage in the region. And, many people lost their lives, whole neighborhoods burnt down. I mean, it was really, really such a tragedy and such a shock. It's fascinating to read the history of Sandy, because 9 days before it hit the city, it was just a tropical storm down in the southern part of the Caribbean. But through a series of events, including the seas being a little bit warmer and the way the storm moved, another storm moved across the continent and combined with Sandy to give it a direct hit on our region. And of course, it was a huge shock for all of us. If you remember those times, not only was there the sort of immediate shock and the fear, but the lights went out in Lower Manhattan. The next the subways weren't working, and so where I live in the Bronx, 2 days later, everybody tries to drive to work, and if everybody in New York City tries to drive in New York City at the same time, nobody drives anywhere in New York City. And then the day after, there was a huge run on the gasoline supply because there were rumors that we were going to run out of gas, and so people were staying for these long lines for hours and hours to fill up their tank. And into this, Mayor Bloomberg said, "We are not retreating. Hurricane Sandy hit us on the chin, and we're going to stand up and we're going to rebuild New York City." And 2 years later, the stronger, more resilient New York report came out. And it, as if overnight, the word sustainability was crossed out of the vocabulary of the city and instead was inserted the word resilient. And if you actually look at the cover page of this report, it tells you what that means: resilient, able to bounce back after a change or adversity, capable of preparing for and responding to and recovering from difficult conditions. Synonym: tough. So we went from environmentally efficient to tough, as if overnight. Fast forward a few more years until 2021, and Hurricane Ida comes in. And Hurricane Ida was such an interesting storm because, unlike Sandy, which was a coastal storm and most of the damage was caused by a large storm surge coming in on the high tide, Hurricane Ida was all about the rain. And in essentially 8 hours, we had a month and a half of rainfall fall in New York City. And the result was that places that flood don't normally flood. This picture on the right is the Major Deegan Expressway, which was competing with space with the drains that drain Tibbetts Brook. And I had people calling me and writing me from all over the city, asking me where did this water come from? Even my house on City Island, the backyard flooded. We live on a hill, and it had never been a flood, but a vernal pool, formed in our backyard and then started to seep into our basement. And of course, people died again, people that were living in basements, and suddenly there were huge floods of water coming in and they couldn't get out and they drowned. It was just such a terrifying thing. And, if you read the reports that followed, they're much less optimistic about our ability to be resilient. Because, the stormwater drains that were constructed in New York City were largely put in, at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. They were designed at the time for the climate of the time, not anticipating the climate of today. And to redo that infrastructure on a citywide scale would, cost billions and billions of dollars, and would, essentially paralyze the city, because you have to rip up all the streets to get to these pipes and lay these much larger pipes. And then you have to guess that you put in the pipes to be big enough for the future. There really is a new normal. And although I think the city is doing lots of interesting things, it's a challenge to get to the scale of intervention that's required. And that's where I think nature comes in. Because if you go and look at the places that were flooded during Sandy, or that were flooded during Ida, and you look at the wetlands are fine. Like the wetlands know what to do. They're used to being flooded with water, and they know how to hold it and then release it, and to keep us all safe. So how do we do that? How do we enlist nature's help in making our city both more climate resilient and capable of addressing the terrible biodiversity losses of our time? Well, I think what we need is ecology. Ecology is a discipline that's nearly 200 years old, and it's literally the study of home. That's what the Greek words mean. Eco comes from oikos, which means home in Greek, and logos is the study of. And I think there's just so much to be gained from studying carefully the way the landscape works in different conditions, and by studying what the different plants and animals are doing and the way that they respond to change. I said, remember I was giving this talk to this Department of City Planning, so I pulled up their website here, and it says, the Department of City Planning is New York City's primary land use agency, instrumental in designing the city's physical and socioeconomic framework. And I said, how about we think about a little tweak to that? What if we say instead, the Department of City Planning is New York City's primary ecosystem agency, instrumental in designing the city's physical, ecological, and socioeconomic framework. Their ambition, and I think the ambition for all of us, is to make all of New York a better place to live, to maintain what works and improve what doesn't. And I would say that that includes the plants and animals, as well as the human inhabitants of the city. So, how would they do that? I mean, what does it actually mean to be an ecosystem agency? Well, I think this is where, you got to think about the ecosystems on a block. We talk about land uses, say at 120 Broadway, the land use is an office building. But I would argue that it's the ecosystem of a building. An ecosystem is defined as the combination of the living components, the biota, and the non-living components, the abiota. So in a forest, as you would see on the left, that is, forest, the trees, the shrubs, the herbs on the ground, the wildlife walking by, the people walking through that area. That is the biota, and the abiota would be the soil and the rock and the climate and the rainfall. And they all work together in a particular way to make sure that that ecosystem works and provides services and functions for all the things that live there. When we convert our ecosystems to these gray ones that are essentially composed of rock, they actually act like rock to shed water, and they might be really great for providing habitat for human beings, and maybe our commensals, dogs and cats and pigeons and rats and things like that. But how do they provide carbon sequestration and water protection? We need to be planning our city with these kinds of things in mind, on a lot by lot basis, but on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, on a city by city basis. One place I suggested that city planning look is in the New York City Nature Goals 2050 Coalition. This is an informal group of about 80 organizations, nonprofit organizations, educational organizations, institutions, city agencies, state agencies, federal agencies, artists, some companies, some architects and landscape architects were involved. And back between sort of 2015 and 2019, right when the pandemic happened, we ran a series of meetings, and the meetings were all premised on this idea that all New Yorkers have a right to great nature. We even wrote a declaration of right to nature in New York City. And then we went through our process, where we defined these 5 nature goals: biodiversity and habitat, coastal protection and resilience, water and air quality, connectivity for people and other species, and inspiration. And then we detailed 525 nature targets, things that we thought could reasonably change between now and 2050 to improve the nature of the city. So, the idea here is to think of the city as part of nature, and that the city has a nature that we can improve and make better the same way that we, work to improve its cultural life, and that we work to address, environmental justice issues or social justice issues for that matter. Or that we fight crime, that actually nature is an essential infrastructure to the city, and it is essential in so many different dimensions that it required 25 targets. And the whole point behind 25 targets, of course, is that no one institution, no one organization, not even something as large as the New York City government, can handle all of these things by itself. We actually have to work together to be able to achieve them. Of course, my little piece of this is to provide insights into the historical ecology of New York City, to try and describe what the landscape was like 400 years ago, and in a fair level of detail. Many of you know my book Mannahatta, which Tomi mentioned at the beginning. I'm currently working on an atlas and gazetteer to the natural geography of all 5 boroughs. So this slide is taken from that, shows the topography around Newtown Creek and the Bushwick Inlet and the East River. So that's Queens and Brooklyn on the right, and Manhattan on the left, with all the streams and ponds and springs and so forth. And it's all georeferenced so that we can actually say what's in those same places today. If you want to explore this more, then you can look at our platform called Vision Maker, visionmaker.nyc, which is a free online platform currently experiencing a small technical problem. So it may not work if you try it tonight. But the idea of Vision Maker, I think, is a good one. And the idea here is ecological democracy, that if we want to create a city that works for everyone, everyone needs to have a say in creating that environment. And so the way Vision Maker works is you create a new vision, or you can browse visions that other people have produced. And the visions are composed of basically 4 elements. You choose a part of the city, then you can change the ecosystems of that part of the city. And that means, you could add buildings, or you can take away buildings. You could add streets, or you could add bike lanes. We have a sort of typology of over 70 different ecosystem types that are each represented by a series of parameters that feed the models. You can also change the climate scenario and change the lifestyle of the people that live in your city. And then the idea is that you can see what the ecosystem consequences of your vision are compared to that part of the city today and that part of the city 400 years ago, in terms of the water cycle, the carbon cycle, biodiversity, population, and so forth. And then you can share your visions with other people. So you can make a vision, you can keep it private to yourself. You don't have to share. You can share it with a small group of people, or a class, or a community group, or you can choose to share your vision with everybody else. And this is one of the things that I'm really hoping in my new job here at the New York Botanical Garden, to sort of pick up and create Vision Maker 2.0 with a new interface, some improved models, some better climate scenarios. The climate scenarios need to be updated, so forth and so on. Because I really think that this is a matter of survival, evolution, and justice. This is why we need to nature our city. Survival, evolution, and justice. And let me just start with the survival one, because I think we can all agree this is a big one. I think we've all seen this curve, right? This is the famous Keeling curve of the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere at the top of a volcano in Hawaii. And I just want you to just take a minute to think about what this means. I mean, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere that you and I are breathing right now is 50% higher than it was 400 years ago when Henry Hudson was alive and the Lenape were walking around in Mannahatta. It's 50% higher. And I mean, just think about that. Like, to increase the atmospheric concentration of the whole world, say that was your objective. Say that's what you wanted to do. And you would have to locate sources of carbon and then discover that they were in these huge deposits underground. And then you would have to develop all this infrastructure to dig them up out of the ground, to pump them out of the ground, or to pull up the coal. And then you'd have to burn it, and you'd have to burn it in so many different ways. And you'd have to motivate all of society to work for generations and generations and generations of fossil fuel burning in order to do something so massive as to change the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. I mean, it's just such an extraordinary act. And, because of that, it's, the way carbon dioxide works is it's like, I heard this recently, it's like your car on a hot day, the light from the sun comes in the visible wavelengths, and then it hits something, and then it re-radiates at lower wavelengths, and it's hot. That's heat. That's the very definition of heat, is these longer wavelengths radiation. And it's the same reason if you leave your car in the sun, it gets very hot on the inside because the light comes in and then the heat can't get out. And that's essentially what we've done to our planet. And to bring that home back here to New York, these are predictions from the New York City panel on climate change. The graph on the left is the temperature predictions. You can see how the temperature in the past, the observed record, it goes up and down, because we all know that the temperature goes up and down, and it's not the same every year. It has variability to it. But you can see the predictions going out to the end of the 21st century are of much, much warmer conditions, more heat than we have ever seen, in the 20th century, and indeed back to the last glacier. It's going to be warmer than any time in the past. And then also, if you look at the graph on the right, one consequence of warming the atmosphere is you make it possible for the air to hold more water. The water holding capacity of the air is a function of its temperature. And now you've supercharged it with all this extra energy. And so it brings these big storms. And so, although it's a difficult thing to predict what the long-term climate will be, the consensus models that are run on supercomputers suggest that in our region, that precipitation is going to increase about 15% over the course of our century. And that it's going to come in these bigger, more intensive storms like Hurricane Ida. So here's a specific example of how the historical ecology helps. After Ida, I wrote a little op-ed that was in the New York Times saying, all those places that you're seeing in the paper where people died or they lost lots of property, well, they're all places that were in a former stream or a pond or a lake or a wetland. And because we've been studying the historical ecology for so long, we actually know where those things were. So Rohit Agrawala, the chief climate officer of the city and the head of the city's DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, gave me a call and he said, Eric, can we quantify that? Can you actually make that happen? And so we developed this analysis together where we're looking at the historical ecology, the past. We're looking at the places that we know flood today in the city, based on the 311 call records and based on current observations of flooding, and then places that are predicted to flood in the future. The DEP has funded a series of stormwater resiliency maps trying to predict, given different storm events, where it might flood in the future. And the logic here is that if there is a place in New York City that was wet in the past, it's flooding today, and we know that from the 311 calls, and it's predicted to flood in the future, well, probably that's not a good place for somebody to live, or to have their office, or to put a highway like you see here. And these are what the maps look like. So this is looking at sort of northern Queens and the southern part of the Bronx and Manhattan over on the left. And the first panel is the Wallachia project data, the historical ecology data. The light green areas are salt marshes. The dark blue areas are freshwater marshes. And then you can see the streams and springs. The middle one is showing you the 311 call records for the last 12 years. So little dots. We've just extracted the flood related 311 calls. And then over on the right is one of these flooding scenarios. And if you look at this extreme flooding scenario from 2080 and you compare it to the past one, well, you start to see, I think I'm starting to see similar patterns there. And if you do this analysis over the whole city, as we have done, this is what you get. So the dark blue areas on the map on the right, these are the places where it was wet in the past, it is flooding now, and it's predicted in the future to be wet. And those areas represent 10% of the blocks. These are the so-called atomic blocks are basically taking the city center lines and then chopping the city into blocks, individual blocks, the way we think of. So 10% of the blocks of the city are 17% of the city's land area. If you just take the past and the future wet, because everybody knows that there are issues with the 311 call records. mostly that, if a place keeps flooding, eventually people stop calling about it. So there's that. And of course, that not everybody calls from all parts of the city for the 311. But if you just take the past and the future, then it's 18% of the blocks or 24% of the city area. And if you just look at the historical ecology bit, the city's stormwater resiliency maps don't cover JFK or Floyd Bennett Field or any of the parks. And so those areas are in this light blue color you'll see, like JFK or LaGuardia, which are built on, in JFK's case, mostly built on salt marsh. In LaGuardia's case, was actually built in Bowery Bay. You can see that now we're talking about between 37% of the blocks and 38% of the city's land area. So that's a lot, right? That's a lot of the city's land area. And many of these places are people where people live or where we have infrastructure of various kinds and sorts. But it's not everywhere in the city. Sometimes you hear people say, oh, it's all going to flood. And I don't think it's, at least in the course of this century, I don't think it's everywhere in the city. There are definitely higher places that are safer, and there are lower places that are less safe. And just to sort of bring this home, if we look at 3 places that flooded during Ida, the Casina Creek corridor in Queens, Rock Hollow Pond in Hollis out in the Jamaica section of Queens, and the Hole or the Jewel Streets area, which is on the boundary between Brooklyn and Queens around Spring Creek. These are the historical ecology layers, and these are the blue zones that result. So, one of the things I conclude from this is not only do we have a lot of work to do to nature our city, but this is the opportunity we've been looking for to actually address the affordable housing issue. Because if we're going to have to retreat from some, say, I don't know, 20%, 30% of New York City's land area, then in other places, we're going to have to increase density if our goal is to have a city with 8.8 million people in it. I don't think there's any way around that. And of course, increasing density means also being more efficient about how we use space. And, it's a particular bugaboo of mine, but I think it's probably shared amongst a lot of people, that how terrible traffic is in New York City and just how kind of unwise it is to dedicate so much of our city to the least efficient mode of transportation we know of, which is the automobile. I wrote a whole book about this, and as have many people, I think everyone realizes that the car is a kind of chain on New York City, and that we need to be able to change to a new mode of transportation, a new kind of way of getting around in order for our city to survive and to be livable. And then finally, I want to say that this is also our opportunity to redress the terrible wrongs of environmental justice. Because of course, many of the people that live in the lowest parts of the city live in places that are low because it was cheap at one time, or because that was the last place the city owned property when they built public housing. And many of those places themselves were formerly dumps where people would dump, chemical nastiness or dump their garbage. This is a picture from the 1940s of Newtown Creek, and you can see the industry and you can see the pollution. And, people live on this landscape that you see here now. And I did an analysis about 1.5 years ago for NYCHA, for the New York City Housing Authority, where we looked at, where the public housing is and where the former salt marshes are. And about half of the public housing projects in the city are in flood zone areas, which, the city well knows, but they are struggling to know what to do about it. And what I'm arguing here is that we can't just deal with this on an incremental basis, project by project by project. We need to take a full landscape view to nature our city, to create a city that is shared and that works for all of us, works for the skeptical and the intrepid and the creative and the tree into the future. So I'll just conclude then that, we nature our city before nature does it to us. And what does that mean? It means nature will save the city when we take nature seriously in our city making, using the historical ecology as a guide, enlisting vision makers from across the city, and taking climate change as an opportunity to change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric, for that presentation. I feel like there are so many topics you brought up, and I personally learned a lot about New York City's natural history. I didn't know that Wall Street was a wall. It makes sense. So
It's a wall. That's right.
Great. Okay, so we have a few questions in the chat already. Everyone else, if you want to take some time and think about it, go ahead and type your questions in the chat if you have them, or raise your hand. Our first question is from Bridget Jones. They ask, what might the CO2 levels have been in 1400, 1600, 1800, 1930? Do you have any resources that Bridget might be able to follow to learn more about that?
Yes, I can send you some more information about that. I mean, we have the instrumental record from the 1950s. That's when Keeling started making his observations in Hawaii, and actually his son is continuing to make those observations. But by using other proxies, like bubbles and ice cores, we actually have CO2 back not just a few hundred years, but 800,000 years. You have to really give it to the climate scientists. They've really done a great job. So you can. I'm sure if you Google, you can find some of that information, or you can drop me an email and I can send you some references.
Great. Okay, so Kenneth also has a question. And then also, Kenneth, if you feel like asking this, go ahead and interrupt me. So they ask, how do in making ecological predictions, how does Vision Maker handle so many different nonlinear models and the issues of bifurcations, butterfly effects, and other properties of dynamic systems?
Right. No, it's true. The models are complicated, and they're interactive as well. So basically we have kind of three kinds of information. There's the ecosystem parameters that go with each ecosystem types. We calculate the area of the different ecosystems, or forests, buildings, etc. There's the lifestyle, which I didn't talk about very much, but you can pick a lifestyle of the people living in your idea of the future. And then you pick a climate scenario as well. So, those three things are kind of well defined. And if you actually go on Vision Maker when it's working, I apologize for its current technical problems. When you look at it, you can actually go and see all the parameters. The water model is a very simple water model. It's just like a bucket model. Rain falls out of the sky, and then it just allocates it into the impervious stores, and then it flows along. The carbon model has a transportation model built into it, and an energy model. So that's probably the greatest uncertainty in it. And then there's a biodiversity model that works on species area curves, and there's a nice paper about that. So yeah, yes, but I think the more important thing is not, is it the right answer in like God's eye, but what is the relative answer? And if you see 400 years ago, and you had a big storm, and all the water was absorbed by the wetland in the forest, and that same storm today falling, in I don't know, the Bronx just outside the Botanical Garden, and it's a flood. Well, I think that's telling you something, right?
Awesome. Okay, so Bradley, I see your hand raised if you would like to go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. I was just typing it up, but I'm happy to ask it live. Yeah, thank you so much for your work. I really appreciate the book Mannahatta, and I'm amazed by what you've been able to do. In today's talk, I heard you mention the Lenape in past tense, but it seems to me that inviting in Indigenous voices would hit many of your priorities, from ecological awareness to justice. So I was just wondering what your perspective is on inviting in Lenape voices, and then on a more practical level, how we as lay people might figure out the past ecology of a given region that we're interested in.
Yep. Yeah. No, of course the Lenape are welcome. Everybody's welcome as far as I'm concerned. And I used in the past tense when I was speaking about them in the past tense, as in 400 years ago, not reflecting all on their current or future status in any way. So please don't take my verb tense to be meaning anything more than that. So no, of course. And of course, there are Lenape people living in New York City today, as well as in Oklahoma. And there's two nations in Oklahoma, and 2 other First Nations in Canada. And then a whole slew of other unrecognized groups, according to the formal government thing. So, the Lenape diaspora it's a terrible thing to read that history and to think about what it means. And it wasn't just what happened in 1609 and right afterwards. It was a continuing thing that happened for hundreds and hundreds of years, and those people are still struggling with the consequences of that. obviously. And in terms of the current, to try and understand what the historical ecology of where you live, well, that's this new book that I'm writing, the Wallachia Atlas and Gazetteer, which will cover all 5 boroughs of New York City. I should say, Mannahatta was the work of many, many people, not just me. I just happened to be in the middle of laughing, including Mark Boyer, who's on the call tonight, who did many of the images for the book. But in the future, there'll be a website where you can click on any block. Right now, you can do that for any block in Manhattan if you go to the wallachia.org website. But we have the data now to fill out the rest of the city. So we're just trying to raise the funds to make that website happen. And then you'll be able to see these large format maps in kind of the USGS style of the landscape of 400 years ago. And then what I'm spending a lot of time now is writing these short gazetteer entries to the features. So Givens Creek, where was Givens Creek? What was there? What happened to Givens Creek? Why was it called Givens Creek? All the streams, all the springs that we have names for, all the hills, all the valleys. I spent most of the weekend writing about peat bogs that used to be in Prospect Park, for example, and what happened to them. And I find that actually the landscape history is what's informative of so many things. It's informative, of course, the natural history, but also the human history that followed. I think one of the things actually that this latest round of writing and work has taught me is that, New Yorkers have had a strong attachment to this landscape ever since we've been here, and all kinds of New Yorkers, whether they were Lenape or Dutch or British or American or Irish or whatever, African American. I mean, everybody cared about it. And it's kind of actually a very narrow slice of time, only the sort of late 20th century, where we have this idea that you live in the city and it has nothing to do with nature and it's somehow strangely independent of nature. And of course, a lot of the work that people like me and the EcoFlora project that Lydia and Tommy work for, and many people that I know on the call, is all about trying to correct that mistaken idea, that kind of crazy idea, really, right? That we're disconnected from nature. And just to bring it back to the Lenape, I mean, I'm not a Lenape person, but I don't think you would have had to make that point to a Lenape person 400 years ago. I think it would have been very clear to them which side of the bread the butter is on, as it were.
Sorry, could you just also say, if we're outside the city, where you would direct us to just do our own?
Oh yeah.
Not to your depth of research, but just.
Yeah, well, it turns out, turns out that cities, because people care about them so much, they have really good maps typically. And so if you go to a public library or you go to, you go to the Library of Congress, there's actually been this amazing thing happening over the last 25 years or so. The map archives have been digitizing their maps, actually scanning their maps. It used to be when I started this work, you actually had to go archive to archive and then ask them to pull the original map, and then you got to look at it and you make your notes, and then they would put it back. But now many archives have searchable catalogs. You can get high resolution maps. You can use free public GIS like QGIS to georeference the maps, and then you're off and running. I mean, it takes a little bit of historical understanding about who made the map, why they made the map, what are they showing, where it fits in time. But I find that work completely fascinating and gratifying.
Thank you.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, something interesting that we have a comment and question here from Naomi. It sounds like many of these goals could be in conflict, fitting in more people while also allowing space for nature, and having flood zones, enabling sunlight to reach the streets. How can all of this kind of be integrated together?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously it's a hard task, but it's mostly a hard task politically and socially, not a matter of the physical environment, because of something called density. Density is how many people live in an area. And if you look at the density map for New York City, you'll see it varies tremendously from one part of the city to another. There are certain parts of the city where, there are 100,000 people or more per square mile. And then there's other parts of the city where it's 100 people per square mile. It's several orders of magnitude difference. So if you have a chance to look at the back of Mannahatta, the very last images of the book are these renderings we did, where we took a satellite image of New York City today, or New York City as it was in sort of 2008, with its 8.4 million people, and then we just imagined them all living at Manhattan density, and suddenly you only need 30% of the landscape. And then the rest of the landscape can be farmland, as it was once upon a time. It could be natural areas. You could have your streams back. And you would have those benefits of Manhattan level density all across the city. I mean, what makes New York City so special if it's not the kind of extraordinary density that you get to experience in certain parts of the city? So there's lots of ways to live on this landscape, and we shouldn't let the current version of affairs limit our imagination about what's possible in the future. Because no other generation of New Yorker has ever done that. So why should we do that? I just don't know.
So yeah, speaking about these visions of the future, and sort of these conflicting goals, I personally have a vision of a very decentralized agricultural system lending itself to a more sustainable future and more sustainable cities. And yeah, overall, like different kinds of social justice solutions linked to decentralized agricultural system. I'm wondering if you have considered that or integrated that into your models, like hydroponics, aquaponics, or just agricultural, like within the city at all.
I mean, a little bit, Tommy. I mean, if you look at Vision Maker, they're like vertical farms. If you want to go the hydroponic route, you can add an ecosystem that's a vertical farm. You can also add a farm field or an orchard, and even choose the kind of vegetables that you're growing or the kind of fruits that you're growing in your idea. It's maybe worth noting that if you go back to the agricultural census of 1870, the most agriculturally productive county in the entire United States was Queens County, New York. And the third most agriculturally productive one was Kings County, New York, Brooklyn. Because, Brooklyn at that time, there was, Brooklyn, like downtown Brooklyn, the way we think of it, on Brooklyn Heights and up from Fulton Ferry. But if you went over the Moraine, it was mostly farmland, and really super productive farmland that was in this kind of virtuous cycle with the denser parts of the city, where the farmers would get up in the middle of the night and use horses and wagons to bring their goods into the city, and then they would come back with euphemistically named night soil that they would then fertilize the fields with, and that worked to create a truly productive agricultural system. And if you study the soils in New York City, you can see why that works so well.
Awesome, thank you. Murad, I hope I'm saying your name right. Murad Morandi asks, where does solar flares fluctuation come into these equations, or do they play a role at all?
They don't come into my equations. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I take the New York City panel on climate change, climate predictions, and that's what you see like in Vision Maker, and that's what I showed you. And they're, very detailed scientific papers, from the top flight climate scientists that work here in New York City, describing that work. So, science is too large for any one person to know everything there is to know about it. So it really is a collegial shared endeavor that we have to work together to understand and to work on. So, but I have to say, one of the things I learned in the process of running Mannahatta is that, as much as we trumpet New York City as a center for media and for culture and finance and these things, it's also this amazing scientific center. I mean, if you want a scientist who studies kind of anything, you can find them in New York City, whether they're in one of the universities or they're in, these scientific institutions like the Botanical Garden or the Wildlife Conservation Society across the street, or AM&H in Manhattan. I mean, there's just such an extraordinary density of scientists working on so many different issues here in New York City. It's such a real blessing that we have.
Lydia, were you going to say something?
Oh yeah, sorry. I was just going to jump in with one of the questions that's a little further down. So this is something I'm curious about too. This is a little bit slightly off topic to what you talked about today, but is still, how do they estimate the biodiversity of the past, especially given that it's kind of difficult to even estimate the biodiversity that's currently currently here, especially with things other than, plants that have pollen, but things like, vertebrates, fungi, other types of plants. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, no, it's difficult and you can't be too precise about it. Obviously there are pollen studies and soil cores and this sort of thing. Also foraminiferans to study the sea level and these anything that sort of leaves a little bit of its body to resist the elements. But something we can be a little bit more clear about is the ecological diversity, the ecosystem diversity. And here, basically what we do is we build models of the abiotic conditions, the topography, like I showed you, the geology, the soil depth, the water table. We match those with place name descriptions that are drawn out of the literature, not just the map information, but also the documentary information. So we spend a lot of time reading local histories of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, and then pulling out little factoids that then we can connect with places on the map. And then from there, the ecology of the Northeast is a well-studied sort of thing. So, if it's this soil type, this sort of topographic condition, it's most likely this forest type. And we actually write the models in a probabilistic way. So it's like 40% this type and maybe 20% that type and maybe 10% this type, where the percentages add up to 100%. So we're not saying, we know for sure it's there. But if you go to the Wallachia website now and you'll see these little green and yellow bars on the side of each species, and those are the probabilities of that species being there. And then we build up the habitat relationships. The actual species list, interestingly, because there's been so many great scientists working in New York City for so long, we have plant lists from various parts of the city that date back to the 19th century. We have the samples in the herbarium here at the New York Botanical Garden, or the ones at the Brooklyn Botanical Garden. There's animal records, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, if you look in the notes to Mannahatta, there's a lot of detail about that.
Yeah, I'm sure that the amount of data that exists is more than one could even. I mean, well, I guess that's why it's more than one person, because one person couldn't go through all of them.
That's right. Well, Lydia, you know about that, don't you?
Yeah, exactly. But it's great to be able to synthesize all of those things together, because that's when you really start to kind of see different kinds of things emerge that you wouldn't see just from having one piece of that. So
yeah. I mean, I figure for the work I'm writing now, is I always try and find at least two references to something to sort of, make sure that they're cross intersecting. And sometimes, you have these little puzzles and it takes a long time to kind of sort it out, and then you find some of the little factoid and then it fits in and suddenly it all kind of becomes clear.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. Another question that we have in here is about city disaster planning, and whether, I guess, what kind of plans do they have now? Are those taking into account some of these things you talked about, or is it more something that they have planned, they say they're going to do in the future?
Yes, and yes. The city, many people in many different departments in New York City are thinking about this all the time. There are whole crews of people whose job is to think about the climate resilience in New York City and how to enact it. On Friday, I gave a talk at a conference that Columbia University hosted on managed retreat as a topic generally, not just in New York City, but I was on the New York City panel with some colleagues from DEP, and one of the Amy Chester from Rebuild by Design asked Alan Cohen, who's
it's boring me now.
Sorry, I'm boring. Anyway, basically the question was how much money is going to be allocated for this? And the answer was $3.5 billion. That's what they're talking about over the next 10 years. $3.5 billion.
Actually, that question was mine, and it was focused on whether disabled folks are being included in that planning. Because
Wow.
disabled folks I just became a cripple in December of 2021. I'm 37. And I've been a bio geek my whole life pretty much. And I've only recently learned a lot of things from fellow disabled folks, and in particular around the importance of disaster planning, and how disabled people are actually kind of underground leaders, because we're always having to disaster plan in our own lives. And because during a disaster, when folks who are used to being enabled by the systems, the infrastructures we all rely on, those systems break down, or you're injured, or you're sick, or you're poisoned, or you're compromised by the air, like basically disabled people should be part of that process. So I'm wondering, I just wanted to sort of throw it out there and ask, because I don't know very much about New York City disaster planning yet, but I'm very interested in it. And if you know of whether the city is perhaps incorporating any folks from the disabled community in that process, in that $3.6 billion.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know the details, Bridget. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. I don't think that's the thing. I don't think anyone has.
Yeah. But it's a good question.
Really.
Good question.
All right, looks like we have Gloria has her hand raised if you want to go ahead.
I have to speak softly. I'm at the library, but I live in the Bronx. I've been a member of the New York Botanical Garden for years. My membership lapsed in October, but is there value in being a member of the Botanical Garden at the higher levels in terms of supporting work towards climate change? Because right now that's my focus, climate change more than biodiversity. And I just wonder if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, Gloria. I'll just say that the garden has a policy that any Bronx residents can come and visit the garden grounds anytime you want. So you just have to show up and show that you live in the Bronx. So that's all free. You don't have to be a member to do that. But I do, I would encourage you to support the Botanical Garden, I suppose. I mean, the reason they hired me, and I've only been in my position for 3 months, is because of the climate change issues, right? That's my entire job, is to think about how can we bring the assets of the New York Botanical Garden, which are significant, and try and make a difference, beyond the walls of the garden, drawing from lessons that we've learned here at the garden and through our scientific work. So please support the New York Botanical Garden. And if my boss is online, did you hear me say that? Please support the New York Botanical Garden.
And I will throw in there, I know that they're currently working on like the strategic plan for the next 10 years or so. And I know
That's right.
One of the main goals.
Yeah, that's right. Well, yeah, we'll be publishing our new strategic plan in the fall. And actually the number one initiative, our number one goal is around environmental action. The other ones are Bronx Forward. So the garden wants to do more in the Bronx. Digital impact, so expanding our capacity to use technology to do our work, and particularly in the education space. The power of place, and that features very prominently in my work, but also in the way that we manage the garden and manage the Thane family forest here, and management excellence. And I'll say there's a relatively new leadership here at the New York Botanical Garden, and they are really excellent. So please do support the institution.
All right, we got a couple last questions in here before we'll let you guys go. A question from Dottie. How many miles of natural shoreline are there in New York City, and compared to the, I guess, engineered or hard? I don't know what the terminology is for the other kinds of non-natural shoreline, but
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I don't have that statistic right at the top of my head, what the current state of affairs is. But if there's a New York City, New Jersey harbor estuary study that's published every 3 or 4 years, and that's one of the primary indicators that they have. And there's actually been some relatively new oceanographic research, which shows that because so much of the shoreline of New York City is bulkheaded, that the tidal range is actually higher, apart from sea level rise or any other consideration. Just like the waves knocking around against these hard surfaces is actually increasing the tidal range and making coastal flooding worse than it would otherwise have been. Yeah. And actually, and again, I don't quite remember the number off the top of my head, but last time we looked at the natural shoreline of 400 years ago, it was like double the current shoreline, because we had all the salt marsh and all these little salt marsh islands, and so that would have kind of fractally increased the amount of shoreline that we had.
yeah, Dottie, go ahead. I see you have some other comments in there, so if you want to.
Oh, thank you. Eric, my question also is at the World's Fair Marina in Flushing Meadow Park. I've been taking part in a volunteer horseshoe crab rescue over there. Apparently the DEP had put in some marsh grass, and when they did it, they used a mesh netting that was coconut mesh, but it was also reinforced with nylon. So the coconut mesh has disintegrated, but the nylon is catching the horseshoe crabs, the blue claw crabs, and there's also these metal stakes that are sticking up in there that when you walk on we have to put metal in the bottom of our shoes because when we're walking on it, it actually impales your feet. And I need to know who I could contact and how I can draw attention to this. I'm asking you because you're talking about the shoreline and how nature nature's going to take over, but now we're stepping into nature, and this is what we've done. And in actuality, we're hurting them more than we're helping them. Yes, we're putting the grass back and we're stopping the water from coming up into Shea State City Field, whatever it is right now. But what about all these critters that are getting hurt by it? How could we draw attention to it? And do you have any suggestions on what I could do to help it along, bring attention to it?
Yeah, thanks, Dottie. I don't know much about that specific project. Beyond saying that they often do put various kinds of structures in when they try and restore a salt marsh so the plants don't wash away with the waves and the wakes from boats and so forth. But I'm sorry to hear about that. Angela Licata is the director of, which is like the deputy commissioner of sustainability at DEP. So I think she would be the person I would write to, and you can find her email address online. And I know she personally cares a lot about biodiversity and ecosystem restoration in New York City, and maybe she can direct you to the right person in DEP who's in charge of that particular project.
That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hi, Dottie. This is and hi, Eric. This is Jamie Ong at New York
Hey, Jamie.
Parks. Great talk. I just wanted to respond, Dottie, to your comment. I think you've been working with my colleague Ellen Hartig, and thank you so much for going out to the site and doing the helping out with the horseshoe crab releases. I was actually on site today with DEP, and we are working on some action at that site. So I can follow up with you directly on some of the work that we are planning.
Fantastic. And please, if there's anything I can help with, I would love to. I'd like to be a part of it as well.
Great.
So there you go. How's that for responsive New York City government? Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Eric, I admit I haven't, I've looked at Vision Maker a little bit, but I haven't dived in and created my own. But I'm wondering, we talk a lot about land use in New York City, but I was wondering what the extent of consideration is for water use and how we might envision using that to lend to sustainability of the future of the city in the future.
You mean fresh water, Tommy, or salt
just sort
water?
of the bodies of water that are around us and how we're using them. I know I think about like the oyster reefs that we're building and potentially some other infrastructure that is being built in the water. Also, like wave energy makers or any kind of other infrastructure that could be used in the water to lend to sustainability. And if that's
well, there is the cool Kate Orff project off the coast of Staten Island to kind of rebuild an oyster reef as a coastal resilience strategy, which I think is super interesting and super cool. In Vision Maker, the way you interact with the water is when you pick the climate scenario, it changes the precipitation events that you have available to you to model, to test, and it changes the sea level rise. So it's a relatively simple, and it uses kind of a bucket model for the sea level. So it basically draws a line and says, okay, well, this is where the high tide line will be in 2080, according to the New York City Panel on Climate Change predictions. And then there are other things on the freshwater side, on the precipitation side. It actually tries to make an estimate based on the population and the water consumption, and that's a function of the lifestyle. So you can put in, one of the fun things you can do is you could just leave your vision the same and then just change the lifestyle from average New Yorker to average American and watch the water go up. I mean, it's pretty incredible. And it turns out that the average American water consumption is not just people like drinking and washing. It's a little bit more of that, but it's also outdoor water use. Most New Yorkers don't use a lot of outdoor water, but most average Americans do use a lot of outdoor water. And so that makes to wash their cars and to water their garden and keep their lawns green and so forth. And so that has a big effect on the per capita water consumption rates.
Thank you.
Yep, sure.
All right, I think there's a good question here to kind of close it off that Yadana asked a little while ago. How can we help people, the skeptical, intrepid, and creatives, tourists, children, adults, teachers, to see the ecology and the ecosystems in our city and get them to, and I'll add my part here is, in order to get them to realize the stakes that they have in it and that this is something that they can change.
Yeah. Thanks, Yadana. Thanks for the question. Well, isn't the obvious answer the EcoFlora project? I mean, come on. So yeah, I mean, actually making observations in the field is a really good way to connect with nature and to learn about it. On our side, we're building websites, not just Vision Maker, but Malikia, to allow people to see the historical ecology of their place, and creating sort of other tools, and also sort of trying to provide some of the historic maps so you can see that. And then of course, I think education is the key thing. A couple of years ago, I was at the conservation biology meetings, and I was chatting with this very interesting scientist from Brisbane in Australia, and he was very interested in how long do you need to spend in a city park to develop an affection for that landscape. And it turns out, using a couple lines of evidence, that about 30 minutes a week is about what your average person needs. If you spend 30 minutes a week in a green space, preferably close to where you live, you will form an affection of it. But the surprising thing about the result was that that didn't necessarily translate into a conservation ethic, right? So people, they learned they loved their park and they didn't want to see it messed up, but it didn't necessarily translate into a concern about climate change or biodiversity loss or anything that was beyond their immediate vision. And I said, well, what are we going to do about that? And he said, well, that's why education is so important. And I know that's something that you care about a lot in particular. So, okay, well, thank you everybody for all the questions. As always, New York City, wide-ranging questions, much appreciated. And thank you for your attention on a Tuesday night.
Yes, thanks everybody for coming and for listening and participating. I'm gonna, let's see. If you have any questions, you can send an email either to us, EcoFlora, or Eric. Here's both of those email addresses. And yes, stay tuned for more from us, and go out there and tell other people about this information. All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night, everybody.